The NFL trade deadline is only a week away. What potential moves could the Carolina Panthers make? We'll talk about it right here on Locked On Panthers.
You are Locked On Panthers, your daily Carolina Panthers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, the part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, as always, Julian Council, talking Carolina Panthers with you every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Your team every day. That's our motto here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Subscribe or follow our show for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. And be sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Wednesdays throughout the rest of the regular season, I'll be answering your weekly Wednesday mailbag questions, either at me or DM me over on Twitter at Julian Council to get a question in for this week's edition of the weekly Wednesday mailbag right here on Locked On Panthers. This episode of Locked On Panthers is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started today. Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer going to join the show today, as we'll talk to Mike about, well, all the things that's going on with the Carolina Panthers. Their 0-6 start, what they're going to do coming out of the bye week, the change of Thomas Brown now being the play caller as he's the OC here in Carolina, and what potential trades Carolina Panthers could make as the deadline approaches next week. So Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer coming up right here on Locked On Panthers. Back here on Locked On Panthers, and as promised, Mike Kaye. He's one of the beat reporters for the Charlotte Observer covering your Carolina Panthers. He is so kind to join us as he's taking care of a newborn. Mike and his wife just welcomed baby boy number 2 a few weeks ago. Mike, how you doing, man? How you getting any sleep?
Yeah, I mean, I'm counting my wins because in my profession, it's been a little bit difficult over the last couple of weeks, but no, it's been great. Both boys are doing well and healthy. Mom's doing great. And I'm just very tired.
Yes. And well, you and a lot of people are very tired here in the Carolinas. You're tired because you're taking care of a newborn and another boy. And also because you're covering a Carolina Panthers team that is 0-6. And a lot of people who listen to the show, a lot of folks here in Charlotte and throughout the Carolinas and all over the world that are Panther fans are tired of seeing the same results year after year. As we sit here heading into the Week 7 bye, the Panthers are 0-6. They have found creative ways to lose all of these games. There's talk about trading away some key players for assets as the trade deadline approaches in a few days' time. But when I look back at the first 6 weeks of the season, while they're not a great team, does it feel like they should be an 0-6 team to this point in the season? Like, I look at Minnesota, Atlanta, it felt like those are 2 winnable games. Like, they're 0-6, they're not great, but should they really be the worst team? Are they really the worst team in the NFL in your mind, just from what you've seen?
Well, I mean, it's tough, right? Because I do feel like the Vikings game really stings. That was a game they definitely should have won. The Atlanta game they definitely should have won. I thought before the season started, I was the guy who was kind of like, ooh, curb the enthusiasm. I've been on the show a bunch of times and kind of not preach patience, but preach that, like, I think people are getting a little overzealous with expectations. Yeah. I thought they'd be 2-4 at this point. I've said since Wright got hired, since the schedule's been out, that this was always going to be a survive to the bye, and then you can do some damage in the second half and make your numbers look really pretty. Because really, realistically, as you said, should they be the worst team in the league? There are teams that are just as unimpressive that are coming up on this schedule. Now, I think what's glaring is the offense, but then you look at the numbers, they're actually the top offense statistically from a points per game standpoint.
Shocking.
And as I wrote in my column before at the bye, the NFC South kind of runs like an ill-conceived pop-up carnival in a random parking lot. It's just like there's a lot of weirdness. There's like a lot of uneven statistics. There's weird outcomes. There's probably going to be a Spirit Halloween store set up soon within the division, I'm sure. Like, it's just like one of those weird divisions. And I think, look, I don't think this season's ever been about playoffs. I think it's about Bryce Young. And honestly, the last 2 weeks, I've seen a lot of tangible growth from him. And we've seen some signs of that Bama Bryce. Not enough, but we've seen it. And I agree with you. I don't think they're the worst team in the league. I think the results have been awful.
Yes.
And frankly, you know, for this touted coaching staff, a lot of it has been operational. And I think that's what's crazy. Yeah, the talent level on this team is not very good. I've said it on your show before. This was a very top-heavy defense, and if they had a major injury or two, which guess what, they've had a few of them.
Yeah, 5.
They were gonna sink, and that was predictable. But I do feel a lot of the self-inflicted wounds are the result of coaching. I think tackling's been terrible for a team that has nothing but veterans on defense. The offense, they signed 3 guys that they thought could really harbor a strong environment for this team who have not shown up. DJ Chark has not played well. Miles Sanders has not played well. I forget Hayden Hurst exists half the time. Like it's troubling because this staff has such great resumes and they led with this staff. And I know I'm going on a tangent here, but like eventually you've got to realize like, hey, this isn't just on the talent, it's also on the staff, who wanted a lot of these guys, by the way.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I agree with basically, everything that you laid out there. And I was on the same part. And we've seen eye to eye on a lot of things leading up to the season. Like, I didn't think this was going to be a playoff team. I've long felt like the most important thing, especially when you give up what they gave up to get Bryce Young, is to develop Bryce Young and to put the best team around him, which of course they did not do that. Wide receiver, there's reasons why they weren't able to do that. One of them, you traded DJ Moore. The second, you look at the market and what was available to you at the wide receiver position. So it really shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone that was honestly looking at this team without black and blue glasses, that was probably going to be a sore spot throughout the season for the Panthers, aside right now from Adam Thielen, who I think has been terrific and probably a little bit more than I expected. I thought he'd be a good player. I didn't think he would be this good at age 33. But unfortunately, yes, they are not 2-4. They are not going to be able to capitalize on a weak schedule and then get around 500 coming out of the bye. It's going to be all about what they can do to help Bryce moving forward. One of the things that they're hoping can help Bryce move forward is by having Thomas Brown be the play caller. That was the news of the day on Monday. And quite honestly, I'm pretty sure you agree with this, the easiest thing the Panthers could have done at 0-6 when it comes to changes. Some fans want to see trades. We'll get into that later. Some fans want to see Scott Fitterer get fired. I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, if at all, throughout the rest of the season. But changing play callers was a pretty simple thing for Frank Reich to do. Now, Frank says that was always the plan to do it at this point in time. If they're 6-0, is that the case? Have a hard time believing that. But either way, Thomas Brown is the play caller. That's the right choice. I'm just wondering, how much is that really going to change for the Panthers over the next 11 games of the season with him as the primary voice to Bryce Young?
So I think I wouldn't even look at it as like an offensive move. And I wrote this in my column. As we brought up, the pre-snap penalties, the lack of discipline, the defense giving up 42 points in back-to-back games. This team needed an overarching view in game. That's what Frank needed to focus on, in my opinion. Something like, if you look at the history of guys who are play callers and head coaches, the success rate is very slim, or they've given it up down the road. Like, Andy Reid is a very rare commodity, but in Philadelphia, he was routinely mocked for his in-game decision-making. We also have seen that with Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay. Their in-game decision-making is not always the best. They're terrific play callers. Patrick Mahomes can hide a lot of things. So can a great system that's endured the way the Shanahan system has. They also have a great defense. I think, like, for Frank, and I know he did it for 5.5 years in Indianapolis, but that team also never won a division title in arguably the NFC South of the AFC. So aptly named the AFC South.
Yeah.
I don't
South's
know.
not very good at NFL football.
Right. I think it's more SEC, ACC town. That's the excuse. I think this was an easy card to play. I think you have a young, up-and-coming guy who's extremely sharp, who clearly wanted Bryce Young. I know there was the scuttlebutt about, which I didn't think was very fair, but that's neither here nor there. I think when you look at Thomas Brown, he has a lot of conviction, speaks with purpose. And I think having one direct messenger as opposed to two is always more productive. I was reading this the other day. I don't know if you know about Endeavor, like UFC, wrestling, Ari Emanuel, all that stuff. So
Yeah.
Endeavor is an agency. They just bought WWE. And I read this quote from somebody that Ari Emanuel, the head of their operation, I forgot where I read this, but the head of their operation believes in having people that you hire do the jobs they're hired for. And I think when you hire an offensive coordinator, it's cool to be the play designer, but it's even more important to empower them as the play caller. And I think as the head coach, we're seeing a lot of CEO head coaches have success. Nick Sirianni is one of them, who also gave up play calling his first year in Philadelphia in week 7. And it had a lot of success after that, obviously.
Yeah. Playoffs that year, Super Bowl last year.
Right. And by the way, guess who his biggest mentor is? Frank Reich. So I think empowering Thomas Brown, who, in my opinion, has been the most impressive guy on the staff thus far, from a presentation standpoint, for the way he communicates, how I watch him in practice. He's a guy who has a background not only as a player, but he has a background coaching multiple positions. He understands how they work. I think what he can do is help Bryce focus. We saw this past week, there was talk about the wristband and simplifying stuff. Well, guess what? They avoided pre-snap penalties. Simplifying and then branching out from there after building a base is really important. And I think for Brown, he's got the opportunity. One, there's a low bar, right, in place. And two, he's about to, look, the Texans defense is terrific. The Colts, they're fine. Chicago, I think this is a really smart move from a PR standpoint too, because frankly, it's the easiest thing to do. I wrote this in my column. Most teams in this position fire a scapegoat coach of insignificance. Might sound like significance on the exterior, but not really on the interior. Or they trade away an ill-performing star player. They didn't do either of those things. And I actually think that's the smart remove from a chemistry standpoint. I get the sense from the locker room that they are pro this move, not that they were anti-Frank, but I think they've accepted this role and they're ready to move forward.
And there's also a thing about it too. Like if Thomas Brown actually would have been the play caller through the first 6 weeks and they're 0-6, like he would have been potentially the scapegoat, right or wrong. And so I think in a way, like Frank Reich maybe kind of took some bullets for him the first couple of weeks of the season, knowing that he had to have known that they're going to have some issues probably with Corbett being out. They could not have predicted Brady Christensen being out for the season with the bicep tear. Bryce being a rookie and that learning curve, as much as they said he was ready to go, there was always going to be a learning curve for a rookie quarterback. Then the wide receivers, that has not obviously been great so far for the Panthers. But let's take a quick pause here, Mike, and come back, get into some more things as the Panthers head into a Week 7 bye here on Locked On Panthers. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. Whether you're prepping for a daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you players that are guaranteed to fit on your roster. So let's see who Vinny has picked out for us on this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. Coming off of a bye, Jets wide receiver Garrett Wilson will be looking to build on his momentum of improved Zach Wilson when the Jets face off against the Giants in Week 8. The Giants secondary has struggled in coverage already, giving up big games to Deebo Samuel, Tyreek Hill, and Stephon Diggs. Garrett Wilson hopes to continue the trend of other dominant number one wide receivers. Look for him to keep coming through with his best all-around game yet in fantasy in 2023. Vinny Iyer from Locked On Fantasy Football is going to help you win your fantasy championship, and eBay Motors knows the championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. Same with your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof rack, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebay.com/motors. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, back here on Locked On Panthers, Julian Council with Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer. Follow him on Twitter at Mike_E_KAYE. And check out his latest column at the Charlotte Observer, 5 thoughts on the Panthers at the bye. Play calling switch is about more than just offense, as we just went over there with Thomas Brown now taking over the reins as a play caller starting in week 8 against the Houston Texans at home, which will, right or wrong, be a referendum game on Bryce Young, where the Carolina Panthers got the pick right. Way too early to do that, but it's going to happen soon. And I mentioned before the break, Austin Corbett, it's Wednesday of next week, right, is the 1-day period where that's the end of it, where you'd have to be activated. I imagine that will be the case, that he'll be activated and he'll be right back there at right guard. How big of an impact do you think he can make coming off of that ACL tear? And then who do they slot in there at left guard? Will it be Zavala when he's back healthy, who's had his ups and downs? Do you think maybe Cade Mays sticks there for the time being as far as the offensive line goes here in Carolina?
Well, I'll say this straight up, and I've said this pretty much since he got injured. He was the best player on offense last year. It was, and I don't think it was close. I really don't. I think Austin Corbett was the best player on offense last year. He's what made the offensive line go. He made Bradley Bozeman look really good. He made Taylor Moton look really good. He made James Campen look really good. I can't praise that guy enough for his performance last year. Coming off an ACL, it's going to be difficult. I mean, he hasn't had live reps in forever. I saw him out there practicing. He looks agile. He looks really good. I would give it a couple of weeks. But yeah, I think when he comes back, that solidifies a position that has been an absolute turnstile and terrible spot for this team. And I think it's impacted Bozeman. I think it's impacted Moden. I think Zavala is a guy, like, we need to get updates on his neck, obviously, but he was, walking around the locker room the other day, seemed to be in good spirits. I think Cade Mays is a really good player. I've said that on the show before. I think right guard, he kind of struggled. He is probably more of a natural left guard as a natural guy who has played tackle and center. That's probably a better transition than being the right guard. I could see them sticking with him there. I think Calvin Throckmorton did a pretty okay job at right guard. Not great, but maybe they consider him there. Look, the options aren't great. I mean, but Zavala is a guy that they want to be a long-term member of this group, and I thought his tape was phenomenal. I'm puzzled as to why he played so exceptionally well at right guard with limited reps in week 1, and then moved to his natural spot and just completely his performance imploded. So maybe he needs a reset, and maybe that's what this could turn into. But I think left guard's still up in the air, and that's a really important spot because it's really tough as a left tackle to block, knowing whether or not you can trust the guy next to you. And I think that's played into Ike Ikwanu's struggles with his turnstile. Brady Christensen had a really, really strong week 1. It's a shame that he got injured, but they've got to figure it out.
Yeah, that they do. And I would think that going to younger options probably makes the most sense. You talk about Zavala. I mean, Cade Mays is only in his second year as well, so that would make sense for the Panthers. Probably get the younger options, but if they're, I don't know, think about trying to win more, than maybe Throckmorton's the best option. I'm not quite sure, but getting some stability will help. Because I told fans a couple of years ago when they were 5-12 during that 2021 season, 13 out of 17 games had a different combination of starting offensive linemen. And the talent level was not great. But if you're not healthy, you're not going to have success. If they're all healthy for 17 weeks, I think they probably would have been a better unit. Not a great one, but a better unit than what we saw there in 2021. I feel like that's kind of been the case so far, as they've had 4 different starting combinations in the first 6 weeks of the season. And once Corbett comes back, it'll be 5 in the first 7 weeks, and hopefully it'll be the same 5 the rest of the way once he is back. Now, that can help the Panthers offense. Thomas Brown now is a play caller, and Bryce Young getting that one singular voice. You talked about it earlier. DJ Chark, haven't got much out of him so far here in Carolina. There was a connection between him and Bryce down in Spartanburg that has not carried over to Cedar Street or on Mint Street so far this season, or anywhere else they played so far here in the NFL. Hayden Hurst, APB, where's he at? And I feel like he's probably got to be pretty frustrated by the situation too, having chosen to come here in free agency. And then Miles Sanders, I show him a little bit of grace because the guy missed preseason with groin injury, popped up in the injury report a couple weeks ago with the groin injury, that missed last Sunday with a shoulder. He's obviously not healthy. Can Thomas Brown potentially get more out of those 3 individuals to help turn around this offense, or at least get them on track in the final 11 games of the season?
Well, I think part of the issue for Chark is he's kind of playing traditionally out of pocket right now. Like, he is not an X receiver. They have him on the line of scrimmage. He's facing a lot of press coverage. He's not historically known for getting off press coverage. He's more of a natural Z receiver, but they want Mingo there, and Mingo's head is seemingly swimming if you watch tape. I was kind of critical of that pick. I mean, I gave it a B- in my grades, but like I thought they overdrafted him a little bit. I didn't think he was ready. I've been on the show before and said I didn't think he really had a particularly strong training camp either. But I think Chark is kind of miscast here just based on the norm. And that hasn't helped him.
I mean, that's the staff more than him, right? Because you go back to when they brought him in, they said, hey, we want to work on the entire route tree. We want to make him an overall receiver. But it seems like, obviously, from what you're saying, that has not really panned out for him, and he's better suited playing Z. It might make more sense for the Panther. I don't know.
I mean, I think originally they were like, well, we're going to move around guys and everything. And they kind of tried that the first 2 weeks. And then it was just like, then you kind of forget Terrace Marshall's there, I guess. And then,
literally forgot he was there.
Yeah, whatever. I think like the problem that they have is they don't have guys that can get off press coverage. There isn't a guy on the roster who can get off press coverage and be consistently successful. So you go with the veteran over the rookie whose head's swimming, right?
Yeah.
X is a very complicated position when you are, you got to be on press. You got to keep, your route perfect. You got to be there for a timing standpoint. And it's just not working out. I think with Hayden Hurst has never been like a primary option in an offense. There's a reason why he's bounced around the league a lot. He's not a particularly strong blocker. I think that plays into it too, especially when you want to run a lot of 11 personnel. When you run 11 personnel, you want a guy who can block and catch. And we saw from Tommy Tremble, he showed kind of the ability to do both last week when Ian Thomas was out of the lineup. They've kind of been in this timeshare with Ian Thomas and Hayden Hurst because of blocking and receiving ability, right? Like I know there was like the big thing about the slot fade a couple of weeks ago, but here's the thing: if you're going to run that route, especially in red zone, you want a guy who can at least show that he can block and then kind of get off coverage. Yeah, I think for this team, it is a personnel it's a personnel issue, but guess who wanted Miles Sanders and DJ Chark, Deuce Staley. I mean, the staff, right? Like, so look, I know that Scott Fitterer is taking a lot of heat, but I also think you have to realize, like, I wrote the piece about the collaboration this offseason. It was very collaborative, and sometimes collaboration ends poorly. I think the process has been fine. It's the practice that's been kind of like, I'm trying to think of a word that's polite, but it's been horrific. Like, honestly, the results have been like antithetical to what they thought they'd be. And I think, with Miles Sanders, I do think you have to give him some grace. He played behind the best offensive line in football for 3 years. They've clearly overestimated this offensive line. I think in a lot of ways, this blocking scheme is fighting its strength because Bradley Bozeman's a power blocker and they're running a ton of inside zone.
Yeah.
I think, something Miles has struggled with, and it's well documented. I covered him his first 3 years in Philly. He struggles with vision between the tackles, and they have tried to run a little bit more north and south, obviously playing to their strengths interior wise. It's harder to play in space when you can't trust your guards. And I just think the results have been kind of middling. You watch Chuba Hubbard, he runs north to south like his hair's on fire. And I think that's kind of, I know a lot of people bring up Deontay Foreman, but there's a reason why Deontay Foreman wasn't on the field on third down in obvious passing situations with the previous staff. He is not a known pass blocker. He is not a guy who catches a lot of footballs. You're seeing him be mitigated in Chicago as well.
He's been like barely out there. I think he's been like a healthy scratch 3 times so far.
And look, I get it. When you don't have all the information, or you're not watching film, or you're not watching some of the great analysts out there, and you are just showing up on Sundays because you love the Panthers, I understand why this is confusing. But I think, from the standpoint of like, they thought they had guys that fit their system. They want guys who are multiple. They want guys who can block and catch in all aspects. On paper, in theory, those guys would have worked out. I kind of think like when you bring in these middling veterans to support a rookie quarterback and the rookie quarterback isn't ready to uplift the talent, it's really difficult. Adam Thielen, a guy who they got a ton of criticism for giving a huge contract to, is having success. You know why? Because he's a technician. It's not about skill. He is a technician. The guy's open every single play because he knows how to set up a route tree. He knows how to set up a stem. He's very in tune with beating zone coverage, which the league is very heavy on. If you want to match him up in man coverage, good luck, because he's going to beat the slot receiver because he can out technique you. And I think they focused a lot on getting the right people in the building. I don't know if they got the right players necessarily with how this whole thing has played out.
Yeah, and the hope for them is that, of course, they can win some games down the stretch. I don't think that at this point in time, hot seat really is a worthy conversation to have. If the results are continue to be this bad where they don't win games, and yeah, we can have that discussion, but they'll likely get an opportunity this offseason to correct some of the wrongs that they made this past season. But I want to get into some of the trade deadline stuff that you wrote about. Also, your thoughts on Fitterer, because you brought it up. There's been a lot of fans that are calling for his head. I question how many of the moves really were on him, because you talk about the staff, some of these guys wanting Miles Sanders, wanting DJ Chark. Can you really blame the general manager if the head coach and the assistant head coach are really wanting him to be on the roster? So we'll get into that here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers.
Snap into the action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get into the action than right now. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, back here, Julian Council with Mike Kaye. Again, follow him on Twitter at Mike_E_KAYE. Check out his latest work over at the Charlotte Observer. 5 thoughts on the Panthers at the bye. And getting into more of those thoughts, Mike, and not something that you wrote about, but a lot of fans out here, they want blood, man. And okay, cool. Frank Reich not calling the plays. He's still here in Carolina. We'll see how that transition works for the team with Thomas Brown being the play caller. But they want an actual head, and that head is Scott Fitterer, who they look at as the next guy in line to be axed here in Carolina. I wonder how many of the decisions of the past when Matt Rule was the head coach here and had obvious power, and David Tepper talked about it when he fired Rule, that I would likely not have an arrangement with a coach like that again. You think about David Tepper and his involvement here. You have Rich Eisen, Stephen Holder saying the open secret in the league is that the owner was the one that Bryce Young that wanted Bryce Young, but Thomas Brown, of course, has come out and said that Bryce Young was #1 on his board. What are your thoughts on the criticism of Scott Fitterer and whether he is somebody that could be right there on the chopping block if it continues to go down this direction in the second half of the season?
Well, first I would say you're right. What's difficult about this evaluation is, right, that he came in the middle of Rule's tenure. You're not really sure who exactly is what. Like, I mean, look, he came in this offseason and made it sound like you had to earn your spot. And I think he felt he didn't fall through with that. I mean, they cut Braden Smith, who had a lackluster training camp. Shi Smith was a guy that wasn't on scholarship. Like Keith Taylor, another guy who was not on scholarship, who he was here for their drafting for the most part. Like, I think that is commendable. Okay. But I also think, like, you have an owner who signs off on moves. You don't trade up to #1 without the owner signing off. You don't draft the quarterback without the owner signing off. I think that's something that's really interesting in here, right? Because the owner was so a part of this quarterback process. Now, that's not strange. When Carson Wentz was drafted by the Eagles, Jeffrey Lurie was at the Senior Bowl. Like, this is not, like, that's not abnormal. When you're an owner who's even somewhat involved, I think that's pretty normal. And this isn't a defensive Fitterer. I think the process for most of these moves has been really fine. I think the practice is what's been the problem. And I don't know, like, I praise the collaboration. I'll hold myself accountable there. Throughout the summer, I wrote the story about their collaboration in the front office.
Yeah.
But at some point, collaboration can lead to too much, right? It's too much conversation. You're the GM, do your job, right? And I understand why folks are mad. A lot of people see Scott Fitterer as an extension of the Matt Rule era, and that's completely fair.
Yeah.
I think from the outside looking in. But to me, he traded up to get the #1 overall pick. That's something that has to satisfy an owner or it's not made. He got the quarterback they clearly wanted. Whether anybody else wanted Bryce Young, the owner had to sign off on it. So he wanted Bryce Young. I agree. Thomas Brown clearly wanted Bryce Young, and frankly, I think I don't want to get out of turn here, and I'm not gonna hate on other reporters. I think Steven is. I didn't see the Eisen thing, but Steven is pretty much on point about everything. But I also think it's kind of unfair to allude to Frank not wanting a guy when it could have been like, yeah, maybe he might have had a preference. That doesn't mean that he didn't want Bryce Young, right? And the only people that know are the people that are in that room, truthfully.
True.
And so I think, like, you did want to collaborate. Frank's been very open and honest about how collaborative Scott is. That's his nature in general. He wants other people's opinions. And so I think when you look at what they've put into the roster, they went out and got Justin Houston, who is a guy who worked with Frank, and Frank vouched for him. You know, there's DJ Chark and Miles Sanders who worked with Deuce Staley. You know, there are guys that they brought in on this coaching staff, you know, that the coaches wanted, right? And so I think, like, eventually this touted coaching staff that they built this entire PR plan around eventually had to coach, right? And you've got look, on offense, they've got 3 rookie starters. That's impressive. Now it's going to take time with those guys. On defense, it's almost like they don't have any young guys that they really want to coach up or have stepped up, right? And I think, look, I think there's still some Matt Rule carryover here to an extent. I think they've done a really good job with the Yetur Gross-Matos. Jeremy Chin, obviously, that's kind of been a top talking point and hasn't worked out.
Yeah.
But I think, like, you know, from a grace standpoint, does Scott Fitterer deserve grace? I don't know. But I think from, like, a pure evaluation, like taking a step back standpoint, I don't think he's done a terrible job from the outside looking in. I think the results have been terrible.
Yeah.
And I think that's co-owned by a lot of people in that building.
Yeah, and that's a good way to put it, because I feel like these conversations are always more nuanced than like, oh, fire the GM, he's done an awful job. You just got to really look at it. And you talk about the collaboration, it's more complicated to figure out, like, whose decisions were these. And when you look at every certain case, like the trades haven't necessarily panned out as far as the players that they've acquired, even though Sinjay Henderson has played his best football of his career probably over the last couple of weeks. But that still doesn't wash the memories of what he did the last 2 years, especially last year in Tampa in week 17 in a must-win game for the Panthers. So it'll be interesting to see. I've felt like, you know, typically general managers get like 2 head coaches, and this is a coach that now Scott's here with. And you talk about, like, the coach has got a coach. They haven't done a great job coaching. And Frank Reich has kind of subtly hinted like, hey, like, I'm here to coach a team. Like, Scott, those guys, they take care of personnel. All right. They haven't really done a great job with personnel. They haven't done a really good job of coaching the personnel. So I kind of feel like they're all tied together. And if this ship sinks, they're all going to go. I just don't know how it changes anything by bringing in Fitterer. Now they got to do a better job drafting, because that has certainly hurt them. You talk about how many young defensive guys they have out there, but they're not too far removed from having a 7-man defensive draft class in 2020. And then there's been some primary players in 21 that were on that 11-man draft class that were also defensive players that really aren't out there. The main one is Jase Horn, because he can't stay healthy. So it'll just be interesting to see how it all moves forward. Now, you bring up Jeremy Chin. When you first wrote the article, you mentioned as someone who could be on the trade block. He's played only 58% of the snaps so far this season on defense, which is down from him playing 99, 97, and 91 in the first 3 years of his career. So he's off the board. I wonder what his future is in Carolina. It feels like pretty obviously he probably won't be back here once free agency starts in March. But as far as the other candidates out there, you believe that it makes sense to go out there and recoup draft picks. I think that makes way more sense than going out and trying to get a top tier receiver, because that's going to totally happen at the end of October in the middle of the season. So who are the other guys that would make sense, and you think that could actually be on their way out of Carolina? Of course, fans are going to be thinking Brian Burns would be the number one if you want to get like maybe a first round pick as far as compensation goes.
Yeah, I think if it's not nailed down, you should be open to conversation, right? Like, so if a guy's in the final year of his contract, cool. If a guy is not performing to his contract, cool, take the mulligan. I think with the GM stuff and like the hot seat or whatever, you've got to kind of also acknowledge that as a GM candidate, how appealing is this job? You just trade away your 1 next year and your 2 the year after. The entire point of the GM's job is to have an overarching look. And if you just gambled what you gambled for Bryce Young, firing the guy who you signed off on getting that stuff kind of is, poor process. Anyway, but with Scott, look, here's what I will say. Other GMs like working with Scott. Scott's got a lot of connections around the league. He's gotten some pretty good deals. That Robbie Anderson trade is an all-timer. I don't care what they get for it.
Yeah,
I don't care who they draft. That is the most farcical trade I can ever remember covering with a team that I've ever I covered Howie Roseman, and Howie Roseman wins trades outright. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I would say Dante Jackson, the soup du jour of the trade market now is to pick swap. To get out of that contract next year, he's got a pretty hefty signing bonus. It's just not working in this scheme. Obviously the most recent thing is the Tyreek Hill thing where he played press coverage. And for me, it looked like they were playing cover 4. And so that's why Farley reacted late on that play. It seemed to be solely on Dante Jackson. I think he's a guy that if you could sell to a contender as a number 3 corner, especially if they have a guy who is an outside guy who moves in to play nickel often, which is now kind of like the NFL thing. If you could trade like him and a 7th for a 5th, I think that's a really sharp move. Now, it takes 2 to tango. Can they get somebody to do it? Terrace Marshall's a guy. If you can get a 4th round pick for him, I think with the way the staffs use him, I think there's logic to that. I mean, a team like the Jets, if they needed another wide receiver, or the Chiefs, I mean, I know they just traded to get Nicole Hardman back. The Eagles just signed Julio Jones, but that was another team that would have kind of made sense for them there because he can be kind of a big slot. Again, can't get off press. I think another guy who would have made sense prior to injury, like Jeremy Chin and Tommy Tremble, feel like opportunity losses there because they waited too long to trade Jeremy Chin. Yeah. He would have had interest, is my understanding. And then Tommy Tremble's a guy who's got special teams upside. We saw against Miami. He's really, I would expect for him to play a lot more under Thomas Brown. I'll put that out there.
Okay.
And I think maybe not immediately, but I think that's coming. And I think when you look at like Ian Thomas going down, they're kind of hurt from a tight end depth standpoint. They had 5 tight ends at one point. I don't know why they needed 5 tight ends because they're not really using them. Although special teams, I will say that like Sully and Gio are 2 guys that Chris Tabor loves. Another guy who could kind of make sense if he gets interest is Sam Franklin, just because you're getting to see him play more defense. Xavier Woods. Okay. He's in the final year. I mean, he's on a 1-year deal. I don't think it's likely. I'm not. This isn't a report. This is just like if you're looking at the roster and
I just look at Franklin as like one of the. You talk about the defense; it's pretty top heavy. Like he's the best depth piece they have, other than like I guess Camus, who's a veteran.
Yeah,
but like as far as like young guys that have developed here in Carolina, he's probably like the best depth piece they have on that defense.
But if somebody throws you a 4.
Yeah, I mean, duh.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying they would, you know what I mean? But it's just like, at some point you have to say to yourself, like, hey, when's the last time we talked to Frankie about his extension? Like, if he's not in the same ballpark as us, do we look into this? Because he's the type of guy that the Eagles or the Chiefs or the Bills, that's the type of guy that you take a swing at because his market's also really complicated.
The Bills for sure with Milano being out.
Right. But here's what I would say too, is like his market's really complicated because he's an edge who is playing inside. He is not a natural pass rusher. We've talked about it on the show before. He is a blitzer, like one of the best blitzers in the league. So like really the comparable for him is something between a Hassan Reddick and a Milano. Like, I mean, really like his market is really going to be interesting to kind of piece together. I think if you look at the rest of the roster, it's kind of hard to find other assets other than Brian Burns, who's essentially their get out of jail, but pretty scathed. You know, they're not going to get 2 1s and a 2. That's not going to happen. But if I'm the team, I can sell that, hey, we thought we were going to be more competitive this year. We thought that we could sign him long-term. We kept him for an extra year, which devalues him because now it's time to get to the negotiating table. Somebody's going to have to pay him top of the market money. We have not been able to agree no matter what we've done. They wanted to pay him. It's just a matter of coming to an agreement. So what I would say is like, if you can recruit a 1st and like a 3rd for him, you know, also important to remember the 2 first-round picks were 2024 and 2025. So it's not like they're losing out on the years. again, this would be the spin if I were the team. I don't necessarily agree with it. It's obviously a sunk opportunity cost, but I think, at some point you got to say to yourself, we're not agreeing now. Do we want to go do the franchise tag dance, create a rift? He's been very good on the surface about this deal. Maybe it makes sense if the Seahawks, who, by the way, have John Schneider, who is known for sending out picks for defensive players. They clearly value that. They also have a lot of picks still from trades that they've made. Also, good pal of Scott Fitterer maybe bails him out. I think trading for a first-round pick would, just based on talking to the fan base, help kind of reiterate that this is a long-term build. Right now, they don't have that nest egg of a first-round pick, and I think that is psychologically draining for a team that has no hope for the playoffs this year. Mm-hmm. And it's fair. I think it's a very worthwhile and fair criticism, I will say. But also, there's kind of a way out.
Yeah, fans are looking for the next piece of hope. They got a quarterback finally, and it's like, okay, hey, there's hope in a quarterback. Things haven't gone well so far. They're looking at CJ Stroud being, okay, let's find the next piece of hope. Okay, the draft. Oh, there's not a first-round pick. And, I mean, it's just interesting. It's like, okay, you trade McCaffrey, who was a first-round pick, who turned out to be a good player. And, right now, the running back position, they replaced him immediately last year. So far, they haven't been able to do that. They traded away DJ Moore, who's a first-round pick, and they have obviously not been able to replace him so far. It's been early, and now it's like, okay, trade away Brian Burns, another first-round pick, and I think they're going to have even a harder time finding someone to give them what Burns has given them the last couple of seasons. So it's just interesting because, you trade away Brian Burns, of course. This is going to be something where it's going to be a pretty extended rebuild because you need more receivers. You probably need more help on the offensive line, defensively, some depth. I don't know. And you just think about this coaching staff, how long are they going to sit here and build this thing? And how much time is Tepper going to give them? How much patience is he going to be able to show? So it's just interesting to me with all that's going on and just the contract discussions, like Burns. I guess I really haven't heard anything about Jeremy Chin, which kind of leads me to think he's probably gone and that there would have been interest there. Then Frankie Lugo as well. So I'm interested to see how things go. But he's Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer. Follow him on Twitter at Mike_E_KAYE. Check him out there on Twitter and check out his latest column, 5 Thoughts on the Panthers at the Bye. He does a great job. So does Alex Zeitlo, his partner over there on the Carolina Panthers beat. And of course, Scott Bauer, the longtime sports columnist with the Observer. And subscribe to your local paper. A lot of good news out there that you guys should pay attention to locally and statewide, of course, and nationwide and internationally that the Charlotte Observer can give you. But Mike, appreciate your time as always, man, coming up here on the show, and hopefully you can get some better sleep here over the course of the next week before the games or come back here for the Panthers.
I mean, that 40 minutes flew by. I don't know where that went. Time doesn't exist to me anymore, but Julian, I always appreciate coming on your show. You're one of the best in the market, and thanks for having me.
I appreciate that. We'll take a quick pause, and then I'll come wrap up the show here in just a moment on Locked On Panthers.
Great conversation there with Mike Kaye of the Charlotte Observer. Again, check him out on Twitter at Mike_E_K with an E there at the end of his last name. And check out all his work there at the Charlotte Observer. Support your local newspaper, folks. Those people are working hard to provide you coverage of what is unfortunately the worst team record-wise in the National Football League through the first 7 weeks of the season. But that's going to wrap up this edition of the Locked On Panthers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, hosted by yours truly, Julian Council. Again, y'all check out the show Monday through Friday over on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, where I ask you to subscribe and follow the show as it is free. And make sure to follow me, Julian Council, on Twitter at Julian Council, where on Wednesdays throughout the rest of the regular season, I'll be answering your weekly Wednesday mailbag questions, either at me or DM me over on Twitter to get those questions into me for this week's edition of the weekly Wednesday mailbag. And in the meantime, be safe, be happy, be whole. As always, keep pounding, and I'll talk to y'all on Tuesday.